I'm excited to get into this new series with you because apparently there is an epidemic of loneliness upon us. As a lone wolf empath, introverted, neurodivergent person, we've become accustomed to a life of loneliness. Some of us have learned how to embrace it, and others have been utterly crippled by it. A Canadian news channel, Global News, reported in November that the World Health Organization has warned that loneliness could soon become a global epidemic, leading to dementia, heart disease, stroke, and premature death. The WHO, commissioned on social connection, met for the first time in December 2023, and they plan to release a comprehensive report about global loneliness in the summer of 2025. So while we wait for this comprehensive report to be released, let's start talking about this. The Commission on Social Connection is co-led by U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy and Zimbabwe's African Union Youth Commissioner Chito Pembra. Dr. Murthy released an 80-page document from the Advisory on the Healing Effects of Social Connection and Community, which I have read and will present to you in a few parts in this series as I offer my own commentary and certainly welcome your comments as we explore the real roots of this so-called loneliness epidemic. The claim is that loneliness is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. They also reported that loneliness increases the risk of premature death by 30%. Murthy says that lonely people need to search for the healing power of relationships. The U.S. Surgeon General Advisory Report acknowledges that the COVID-19 pandemic made rates of loneliness in individuals increase on an international level, while you and I know that it revealed to many of us how much we actually enjoy being alone. For me, it highlighted how slowing everything down and minimizing social interactions allowed my nervous system to heal and feel more grounded. While everything was closed, it also forced record numbers of people out into nature and city parks that had previously been largely unused. What else this revealed to me was not only our need to connect with nature, but also the need to connect with ourselves. So many people came to see how connection with ourselves had been lost, and the time spent alone was the best way many people learned how important this was to their mental health, especially for those neurodivergent people struggling to live in a neurotypical world. So my first thought on this isn't that we have an epidemic of loneliness at all. And this is an epidemic of complex trauma rooted in capitalistic and ableist attitudes. Now, this ableism term, this can look like many things, but if I use an example of someone who has ADHD, which I'm sure a lot of people with ADHD may report higher levels of loneliness than others, this is looking at where the benefits or practices that have been put in place devalue and discriminate against people with such disabilities, assuming that they need to be fixed or adapt to their environments instead of the environments supporting and adapting to them. The suggestion that we need to get out there and socialize more sounds like it could be an ableist response to a complex issue. And the part that they may be missing, and is missing in a lot of what I read about mental health awareness that comes from the government, is the impact that complex trauma and intergenerational trauma has on our population. And speaking of intergenerational trauma, in terms of the health impacts on African Americans as a result of slavery. There's a blog that I came across with the title, "The Curse of Slavery Has Left an Intergenerational Legacy of Trauma and Poor Health for African Americans." Michael Halloran writes that the intergenerational cultural trauma caused by 300 years of slavery, alongside poor economic circumstances and social prejudice, has led to the poor state of physical, psychological, and social health among African Americans. In James Baldwin's 1952 book called Go Tell It on the Mountain, he asks the question, could a curse come down so many ages? Did it live in time or in the moment? And here he argues that the curse of African American slavery cannot be underestimated. The trauma of enslavement has been carried by African Americans through the ages and generations and is currently shown in many of the health problems experienced by a significant proportion of the African American population in the US. By the way, I've included a lot of these links to the resources that I'm citing below in my caption. There's also an article that I came across in Forbes that was published in February of 2022 called 3 Ways Intergenerational Trauma Still Impacts the Black Community Today. And it's important to understand what intergenerational trauma is. And they write here, one of the major consequences of settler colonialism is the trauma that is passed down from generation to generation. For Black Americans who descended from enslaved people, the trauma that was experienced by their ancestors has been passed down through each generation. And there are 3 important outcomes of intergenerational trauma that deserve further exploration. So let's just briefly take a look at those 3 areas. One is self-esteem. In the 40s, husband and wife psychology researchers Mamie and Kenneth Clark did a study to understand these impacts. And one of the after effects of slavery is vacant self-esteem, which can include feelings of hopelessness and depression. The negative racial stereotypes that have been applied to Black people throughout history may have been internalized and passed down from generation to generation. Learned helplessness may be another consequence of intergenerational trauma. Learned helplessness is the perception that no matter what a person does, they cannot change their situation or condition, and as a result, will stop trying to change their circumstances. The second impact are health outcomes. Racial battle fatigue. Racial battle fatigue is defined as the social phenomenon in which persons who experience chronic racial discrimination develop physiological, psychological, and emotional strain due to excessive amounts of energy expended on race-related stressors. Research indicates that racism is associated with higher stress levels, which can increase the risk of high blood pressure. And as you'll hear in this advisory report, hypertension is something that lonely people are also at a higher risk of having. Hypertension is a condition that afflicts a higher percentage of Black people compared to other racial and ethnic groups. Racism could be one of the contributing factors. This article suggests there should be support systems in place to provide greater accessibility as well as tools for stress reduction, stress management. But no, this advisory is seeking social connection as a solution. The third impact of intergenerational trauma is internalized oppression. People from marginalized groups often internalize racist stereotypes about their own group. And within the Black community, this can show up in a number of different ways. Internalized oppression can also show up as respectability politics, the belief that behaving in a certain way makes a person more valuable and more deserving of respect and dignity. And again, relate this to how neurodivergent people have to align with neurotypical ways of behaving, thinking, and interacting. Overall, this is very oppressing of your individuality, because they state that rates of loneliness are similar all over the world, regardless of a country's status and level of income. And of course, we know that by now. Mental health impacts everyone, regardless of socioeconomic status, because what is also true is that no one is exempt from experiencing trauma. That's the common denominator for me. But we seem to see people with trauma as war vets or people who were severely abused, and we minimize the other ways in which we can experience the impacts of trauma that over time leads to complex issues. Hence the term complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And what is a symptom of that? Social isolation and loneliness. The Surgeon General, Dr. Murthy, provided a letter in his document, Our Epidemic of Loneliness, where he stated, people began to tell me they felt isolated, invisible, and insignificant. Even when they couldn't put their finger on the word lonely, time and time again, people of all ages and socioeconomic backgrounds from every corner of the country would tell me, I have to shoulder all of life's burdens myself, or if I disappear, no one will even notice. He said that social disconnection was far more common than he had realized. He said that in recent years, about 1 in 2 adults in America reported experiencing loneliness, and that was before COVID. The harmful consequences of a society that lacks social connection can be felt in schools, workplaces, civic organizations, where performance, productivity, and engagement are diminished. He says, given the profound consequences of loneliness and isolation, we have an opportunity and an obligation to make the same investments in addressing social connection that we have made in addressing tobacco use, obesity, and the addiction crisis. Aha. Okay. You see where this is going? If we understood the reason why people turn to smoking, overeating, addictions, the underlying reason, remember, in my opinion here, but there are many studies that will back this up, is complex trauma. And how's that response to the addiction crisis going, by the way? Because it seems to me like it's been getting worse and worse. If you're familiar with Dr. Gabor Mate, who talks a lot about addiction and trauma, he says that addiction isn't the problem. It's a behavior that people engage in as a response to trauma. Addiction is a symptom and a side effect of trauma. And trauma isn't what happened to you. It's what happened inside of you, which is also why trauma impacts everyone differently. Many of us with experience in the field of addiction have heard that the opposite of addiction is connection, which is the main basis of why AA meetings were formed, to get people out of their addiction and into connecting with others who are experiencing the same thing for a sense of understanding and support. Having a sponsor, someone who acts as a mentor, someone who's been at this recovery longer than you, can guide you and get you through the same or similar experiences that they've been through too. So while the recommendation is for lonely people to also seek connection, the number one source of their trauma likely comes from within their connections. So just like the addict who is probably also grappling with loneliness and social isolation, lonely people will need to connect with other lonely people. Imagine telling an addict to go to a meeting and connect with people who have never struggled with addiction before. Hey, just go out there, hang around with these people who have no clue what it's like to be in your shoes. They say that if we fail to build a more connected society, we will pay an ever-increasing price in the form of our individual and collective health and well-being. I find this funny because haven't we already been paying a price? Hasn't it already been high enough? They say we will continue to splinter and divide until we can no longer stand as a community or a country. We're already there. You've already built the foundation for that. And not just in America, all over the world. Do you see how we've been programmed into a society that rejects, discriminates, and isolates each other? He says if we don't come together to take on the great challenges before us, we will further retreat into our corners, angry, sick, and alone. Yes. And those are the symptoms of a traumatized person. The divide is a response to trauma, neglect, and a chronically burnt out population who are overwhelmed and can't keep up with the society we already have. It's not because of a lack of social connection. It's because of a lack of self-compassion. If you were to discover the backstory to all of these lonely people, as I've just kind of highlighted a little bit through intergenerational trauma, and those people who say, if I disappear tomorrow, no one will notice, you're going to see the roots in addiction, mental health, history of toxic relationships, racism, discrimination, and dysfunctional families of origin. These are people who are struggling to navigate their attachment traumas, and you're trying to get them to socially connect with all of that trailing behind them. That doesn't sound like an easy solution. Instead, I predict a societal paradigm shift that will spark a new reality, one that we're actually enjoying aloneness and not being shamed for it or told that our aloneness is an epidemic. Join me in the next video as we get further into this report from the advisory committee and dig into the research that they've uncovered on this problem and what they're proposing as the solution to the epidemic of loneliness.